Hi, welcome to our session here on transforming physical activities for the digital world. My name is Tim Pula. I'm the interpretive exhibits inventor for Spark Lab. And
My name is Abigail Phelps, and I'm a lead facilitator in Spark Lab. So I spend most of my time on the floor with visitors, helping facilitate the invention challenges.
so let's go on to the next slide here. So you might be wondering, what is Spark Lab? I know not everybody's heard of it, but Spark Lab is a hands-on invention studio. We are focused on everybody engaging in the invention process. So everyone from kids to adults. Our primary target audience is ages 6 through 12. And our biggest belief is that everyone is inventive. Let's move on to the next slide here. So you might wonder too, where is Spark Lab within Smithsonian, or how does that connect? Spark Lab is housed, our Spark Lab main site is housed in the National Museum of American History. And that's the museum that has the Star Spangled Banner, Thomas Jefferson's desk, the ruby slippers. So a lot of those great objects and artifacts that are part of the Smithsonian collection. Within that museum is the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation. We're kind of a subunit. We have our own director, our own historians, and our own staff, our own PR people that handle everything that we do as a center. So Spark Lab is housed under that museum, within that center, within the Museum of American History. Let's go on to the next slide. And Spark Lab is also around the country. We have Spark Lab network sites in different states around the country. And if you take a look at this map, you might find one that's somewhere close to you, where you teach or where you live. Our Spark Lab network sites are basically little mini versions of our space. We are kind of the flagship, but we are all part of one network, and we all have the same mission of engaging people in the process of invention. And we have coming this year one in Minot, South Dakota, and then we also have a Spark Lab coming up in Singapore this year. So we're expanding even more with more Spark Labs. Next slide, please. So in Spark Lab, one of the things that we really focus on, besides everybody being inventive, is that invention is a process. And you'll see the different steps of the invention process depicted here. These, though, they're laid out semi-linear, but these steps are really not linear. As any inventor would know, and anybody who practices invention kind of would tell you, is this is not, I don't do this in line. I actually go through different paths to actually get to my end product. And that's one of the things that we do in our space, is we get people involved in that process in different points and let them go forward and backward as they need to go. So let's go on to the next slide. Another thing that we believe is that everyone's inventive, like I said earlier. So you'll see on this slide a number of different inventors. You'll see some of the classic inventors you may recognize, like Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs. And then you'll also see other inventors. These are all other inventors that either hold patents or have businesses around their inventions, or are winners of invention competitions. So we try and depict inventors and let our visitors know that inventors aren't just these people that we hold up on pedestals. They're everyone. They're all around us. They're people just like us, people next door. And we want our visitors and anyone engaging with Spark Lab to know inventors are everywhere and everyone. Next slide, please. Another thing is that invention's all around us. One of the things that we often don't think about is how everything that we deal with is an invention. The screen that you're watching right now, that was somebody had to invent that. This program that's running all of this conference, somebody had to invent that and create that software. And you'll see on here some inventions. You know, they can be simple, like nail polish, which is the one on the far left. The butter spreader, simple inventions like that. They can also be things that maybe people don't think of as inventions. So you'll see Eddie Van Halen's guitar in there. It's a rather inventive device, not just the way he played it, but we've had a talk with Eddie Van Halen in a session that American History had done, where he really described how he invented different things for that guitar and changed it up to make it sound the way he wanted to. So invention is all around us, it's not just something that's out there somewhere. It's everywhere. Next slide, please.
This is what Spark Lab looks like, the physical space in the American History Museum. You can see there's various tables set up, and each table has a different activity with a little bit of background information and then a question to get the inventors started. We use various materials, and in the center, the curved table is called our hub, which is our make and take invention space. We use craft supplies and consumables like cardboard, straws, that people can create their invention there and then take it home with them, and they can share it with other people. They can keep working on it. You'll also notice some cases that hold inventions, and Tim will tell us about those on the next slide.
So in the SparkLab space, like I said, we focus on inventors, all different backgrounds and different things that have to do with invention. So you'll see these set of cases on the wall. They contain objects, either museum objects or props that we lay out that get people to think about the invention process, what invention looks like, what types of inventions you might find in different places. We also use the inventor profiles there to depict different inventors with different backgrounds and try and depict inventors that look like our visitors. We want them to know that they are in the same plane as all these other inventors that we have up on the wall. So this is kind of a way to get inspired. And as we go through this this kind of tour of SparkLab, this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of really who we are, but also what this physical space looked like before we had to convert it to something digital. And Abigail will talk a little bit more about that on the next slide.
In the top left corner here, you can see one of our activities called High Wire Driver. And there are some visitors who are testing their invention. So they've already gone through some of the steps of the invention process and are ready to test it and then possibly tweak it. In the right, you'll see an inventor who is possibly experiencing some frustration. Maybe the materials they wanted were not available, or their invention didn't work the way they wanted. And the facilitator is in the yellow apron and helping that visitor work through their frustration. Is there another material you can use? It didn't work the way you expected, so how can you fix that? What might you try differently? And then the picture in the center, you can see a visitor has built a robotic hand and is testing his invention to see how it works and what tweaks he might need to make. Next slide, please.
So now that we've seen a little bit of what learning looks like in SparkLab, we'll take a look at what some of the activities look like, some of these things that engage our visitors in learning. As we develop activities for our physical space, those activities usually fall in one of three categories. They tend to be either creative, or which is something that's more about the aesthetic of an invention, or they tend to be mechanical, which is more about assembling things, putting pieces together, or they can be what we classify as technical, which usually involves some sort of assembly, sometimes some aesthetic, but also involves usually some sort of hooking of wires or connecting some sort of circuit to make a full system go. And you'll see examples of all those on this slide. You'll even see a video game screen on the far right there. One of the things that we try and stay away from, other than for activities like this, we actually try and stay away from screens. Everything is meant to be very tactile and very physical in our space. The only reason we have the screen one is we were actually working on an activity around adaptive gaming. And so wherever that kind of comes into play, any kind of screen time, we figure out how to work it in with the tactile elements. Let's go on to the next slide, please.
In this slide, you can see a couple pictures of other aspects of SparkLab. So you'll see in the top left, there are some inventors working on a mini skateboard, which does go with the picture in the bottom right. That's our community outreach that Tim will talk about in just a moment. In the top right, you'll see our SparkLab library. I am the unofficial SparkLab librarian, so I have been working since I started to grow our collection of invention books. We are working really hard to include fiction and nonfiction, various inventor profiles. We include diverse inventors in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, ability. Some of them are collections featuring many inventors. Some are just one story, but they're always available in the space, and we see lots of visitors take photos of them and say, I'm going to go home and find this later. Or sometimes a visitor needs just a quiet moment while they're in the museum, and they come in and they pick out a book and they just sit and quietly read it. So they're still learning, they're still involved in invention, but in their own way. And then in the bottom left, you'll see our chalkboards. We have 3 chalkboards in the space, and they always have different invention questions on them. For example, right now we have one that says, design a way to make travel more comfortable. And then we have visitors either write or draw about how they would solve that problem. Tim's now going to tell us about the community outreach.
So another thing that we do is we have these invention steps, these invention processes, and all these different kinds of challenges and activities. And we don't just keep them in the museum or at our network sites. We also go out and have done different setups in different, basically pop-ups of our space. We've had one in London, we've had one in India, we've had one in Doha, which was one of our most recent ones. The one on the screen is our Inniskate in London. So our center has a program around skateboarding called Inniskate. And one of the things that we do is we create activities and ways to engage in this process for events like that our center does. So we're both on site, in all the network sites, and out and about as best that we can be. So let's move on to the next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to kind of also get to just before we transition to what it's like or how we convert this to digital is what a SparkLab visit is like, and kind of some metrics of that. SparkLab in general would see about 500,000 visitors per year. That's including our network sites. Our SparkLab space in DC would see about 200,000 of those visitors in a year. The average stay time in our SparkLab is about 15 minutes, which, being that the average stay time in our museum is about 90 minutes, that's a pretty large chunk of our visitors' time. When a visitor comes into SparkLab, they see all the stuff that you saw in the earlier slides, but they're also greeted by a greeter who lets them know what the invention challenges are, kind of what the theme is for the day in SparkLab, and also lets them know that this is the place where they get to be inventive. So this is kind of like that call to action to be inventive. And then as people are inventing in our space, we have facilitators and volunteers that provide feedback and kind of help the visitors work their way through that process and encourage people along the way in the process. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So given all that physical stuff that was going on, we had all that going on, all these different programs, all the tactiles, all the visitorship, all that. And then the pandemic struck, and we had to figure out, how do we convert that into something digital? And I know that a number of teachers are on this right now, and you had to figure out, how do I take my physical classroom, convert it to something digital? We were looking at some of the same questions, and hopefully the rest of this session will give you an idea of how we did that and give you some strategies. Some of the things that were important for us as we went into doing this was we needed to find platforms or ways that people can engage digitally that were free. Our space at the museum, the American History Museum, is free for anybody to come into, so we had to make sure that that was something that was that was in place. We also wanted to make sure that it was safe. Definitely a safe place for kids to use and to be in. We wanted to try and use existing platforms, because trying to set up your own website, own platforms, and all that kind of stuff can be a little bit daunting. So we decided to dive in on existing platforms that we could utilize for creating this creative space, or this digital version of SparkLab. We leveraged some collaborations we had going on at the time, and actually we were getting ready to start step 1 of a 3-step process collaboration with Autodesk. And when the pandemic struck, we went straight from just about to start step 1 to go straight into step 3, which is what you'll see a little bit of today. We also wanted to make sure that everything that we set out there for kids to do in the digital world, that it somewhat gave them little pieces, if not as much of an experience as what you see in a physical SparkLab visit. And we also wanted it to be fun and colorful and exciting. So those were all kind of our goals when it came to going digital. So let's go on to the next slide here. This slide will show you a few of the resources and collaborations that we've had within the museum for digital content. And this should be available to you if it hasn't already been given to you guys. We have a PDF version of this that has all the links in it. At the end of this session, or at the end of our talk, we'll have a question and answer session where we'll have our emails. So if you didn't get that, we can send that out to you and make that available. But these are all different places that we have digital resources available. So let's go on to the next slide here.
One of the digital platforms that we've been using is Learning Lab. It's a free platform that offers access to digital museum collections and allows users to curate a learning experience. You can use a collection that already exists, or you can create your own Learning Lab collection that focuses on your specific need. Today, we're going to look at two of SparkLab's collections, one about toys and one about the shopping cart. Next slide. So in SparkLab, we use Learning Lab mostly for the explore it stage of the invention process. It provides more background information and context for our virtual invention challenges. And we make two kinds of collection. The first kind consists of many objects related to the same theme. For example, we have this toy learning lab that shows how toys have changed throughout history. You can see there's Rubik's Cubes there, and it shows an original Rubik's Cube and then a tweak. It also shows toys that were not good inventions. Yeah. On the bottom row are lawn darts, which were sold and then were taken off the market because they were deemed too dangerous. It also shows how toys have been tweaked. For example, Mr. Potato Head in the bottom right corner was originally just a set of ears, eyes, arms, and legs, but you had to provide a real potato. And then if you move further into the collection, you'll see a current Mr. Potato Head set that includes the plastic potato that we all know. I can just imagine parents finding rotten Mr. Potato Heads underneath their kids' beds or something, and definitely a plastic potato is an improvement there. Next slide, please. The other kind of collection we make focuses on one object and walks the visitor through the entire invention process. This is about the shopping cart, and you can see there are the steps are there, and there are various pictures to show that. There's the sketch of the shopping cart, there's early models of shopping carts, and then a tweak it is the telescoping shopping cart, so that they could be stored more efficiently. Next slide. When we are creating the collection, we are very careful about the objects we select. We try to highlight different time periods, different inventors, or how inventions have changed over time, those tweaks that we were talking about. We also create a thinking routine for the participants. Next slide. So a thinking routine is a set of questions to support observations. We ask the same question every time, so the visitor learns how to look closely at objects and really examine and see what they notice or what is similar to what they know, what might be different. So you can look, these are the questions we use. What do you notice? How do you think it was used? And what do you see that makes you say that? What does this object remind you of? Have you used this object before or something similar? How do you think this object has changed over time? And then we encourage them to think about this, and we include a little bit of information about what the object is that they're looking at and when it's from, who invented it, that sort of thing. Next slide. Here is an example of our thinking routine, we would put this picture of a bicycle from 1885 and then encourage the visitor. What do you notice about this? They might say, I noticed one big wheel, one small wheel. I noticed pedals, like on my bicycle. How do you think it was used? I think it was used like my bicycle, but it's a little bit different because the wheels on my bicycle are the same. What does it remind you of? Have you used this before? Well, no, I've not used this kind of bicycle before, but I do use my bicycle that is a little bit like this, but also has some differences. And then you can think about how it's changed. Next slide. Some things to consider when looking for resources to include in your Learning Lab. We always start with the Learning Lab collection. They have lots of resources already loaded that you can just take and put in your collection. We also then move to the American History collection or Smithsonian collections. And if we still can't find what we need, we move to other reliable sources. If you go back and look in the Toys Learning Lab, you'll notice that we used the National Park Service website to play the recording of Edison's doll. So we make sure that it's a good source, a reliable source, not just a YouTube or somebody's random website. You can include images, videos, sound clips in your Learning Lab collections, and the more things that you include, the more interesting it will be for your visitors. And Learning Lab has features like hotspots where you can highlight a certain area of the picture and draw the user's attention right there so you can really emphasize a certain aspect. Next slide.
So another set of platforms we used, so Abigail just told you a little bit about Learning Lab and our use of that. We also utilize the Instructables platform and the Tinkercad platform, and you'll see the addresses on there. So if you want to take a screenshot, that's fine. It's also going to be in that document that I mentioned earlier. And if you email us after the session, we can send this information to you. Both of these are free platforms. Instructables is a great place for learning about just about anything or how to do anything, and Tinkercad is a great online CAD platform. So we'll kind of take a closer look at those as we go on. So let's go on to the next slide here. So this is Instructables. This is what the Instructables for our Spark Lab setup looks like. These are all the different kinds of challenges that we have. So Instructables, as we went digital, we decided to lay out in the Instructable space the steps of the invention process. We decided to lay out things that link to objects in the museum, things that link to different inventors and some inventor profiles, and then basically to set up that experience of what it's like to walk into the Spark Lab space, the physical space. So Instructables is kind of the digital version of what it was like to walk into the Spark Lab space in real life. And then we had all these multiple challenges. In the physical space, we would have 6 to 8 challenges on the floor at a time. In Instructables right now, I believe we're up to about 12 that you can choose from. And most of these challenges are actually connected to Tinkercad, which is an online CAD program for kids. And there are also challenges here that are connected to being able to do stuff with things that you have around your house, similar to the hub that we have in the Spark Lab space. And then we have another challenge that is connected to Scratch, the computer coding program from MIT. And we use that one as a way to engage people in something that's a little more creative. And then the other nice thing about that is, since we don't really focus on coding, that program exists, and anybody who goes in to use it can get on the back end and figure out, how it runs and be able to modify that. So we get a little bit of coding in there if somebody's so inclined to do so. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide there. this is what Tinkercad looks like. Tinkercad, again, is a online CAD platform. It's made by Autodesk, the same people that do AutoCAD, Fusion 360. These are big programs in the industrial areas of CAD design. And what you'll see there on the slide are a couple of different sets of materials. So basically, these sets of materials represent the sets of materials that you would see on a table at an activity station in the SparkLab space. So if you think back to that earlier slide where there was that big yellow tower with gears on it, or that video game system, this is that space where we would have that happening in the digital world. So let's move on to the next slide here. One of the components of Tinkercad is a space called lesson plans. So as we developed our activities in Instructables, connected them to Tinkercad, and began working through that process, we started to collaborate some more with Autodesk, and they basically had invited us to help create lesson plans for their Tinkercad website. So there are a number of lesson plans on the website from different writers, basically, or different curriculum developers. Most of it's from the Tinkercad education staff because they know their software, they know their back end a lot better than anybody else. But we also have a number of lesson plans on there. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about those. So the lesson plans are basically a layout of, it looks like a lot of information here. I know these are really small, kind of hard to see, but basically there is a lot here. Our lesson plans are set up for 6.5 hours of class time. The lesson plan walks you through all the steps of the invention process, walks your students through those steps. It gives you that invention challenge. It connects to the Tinkercad object that's in the lesson plan and that's actually exists in the Tinkercad space. We also provide curriculum connection information on there, as well as a rubric for evaluation of your students as they go through the lesson plans. So all of this is in the lesson plan space. The things that we have on Instructables are similar to this, but they don't have the richness of all the rubric and all that layout as designed as a particular lesson plan, but the content is still the same. So we have, it's kind of lives in both places, basically. One of the great things about the lesson plans, too, is that if you have students that don't have accounts on Tinkercad, you can actually assign them an anonymous account that they can just use, an anonymous login that is assigned by the teacher to get in there. And everything is kept on the back end of the Tinkercad site. So there's not any forward-facing student stuff unless the students choose to do so. So that's one of those things. And then you'll see a list on the left-hand side of different lesson plans we have available. I think the only one that's not available any longer is Invent a New Toy. That one didn't turn out to be all that popular, so that one has been pulled, but the rest of those are available for use right now. So let's move on to the next slide. So as we kind of wrap up our talk about this conversion from physical to digital, there are a couple of takeaways that we were hoping that you would get from this. First off, there are a bunch of digital resources available. So again, you'll see that sheet with all the different digital resources we have available. Those are ready to go. Even the pieces that Abigail talked about on the Learning Lab platform, they are full of information and richness that you can actually develop a class around. All of it's built out. So it's something that you can definitely easily develop a class around. The Tinkercad lesson plans, they just lay out the class for you and what that might look like. So we want you to think about those as resources that you can use freely for your classroom and for your students. Another thing we want you to think about is not just using the resources that we're providing, but also these platforms are free and we utilize them to create content. They are free for you to be able to utilize and create content as well. So think about that, how you can create your own content and your own lesson pieces and your own stuff in whether it's Instructables or Tinkercad or the Learning Lab. You can create your own stuff for those and your own content for that, and then use that from year to year. So it's a great resource in that way. And lastly, if you're creating content in those spaces, we're creating content in those spaces, we're really able to help shape the learning approach and the learning aspect of kids in the digital world. It's actually giving us a little bit of a foothold in there instead of just consuming things that are maybe commercially available. There's nothing wrong with that because there's some really good stuff out there. But if we can create our own content, it's another way for us to reach the students in the way that we hope to. Let's move on to this last slide here. So I want to leave you with this, with our email addresses. So we've got both of those up on the screen. Feel free to use those if you have any questions about this, about the session. And I want to go ahead and open up our question and answer to see if we can basically, answer any questions that you have. This is if you have questions about the physical space, the network sites, any of the digital content, any of the digital spaces, feel free to just bring those up to us, and we will do our best to answer those.
All right, Tim, we have a couple here ready to go. So Anne asked, how have you been promoting Invention at home during the pandemic, and what plans do you have to continue supporting Invention at home?
That's a good question. So a couple of ways that we've been promoting Invention at home is in our digital space. All of this is stuff that you can do at home as long as you have a computer. So you can do any of that. So that's one way of promoting it. Another way of promoting is one of our pieces on Instructables, one of our lessons on Instructables is around inventing at home with things that you have. And it's actually about inventing musical instruments. So we use that as a great way to do that. And then getting back to some of our SparkLab network sites, we have a couple of network sites that really reach out to the community. And when the pandemic took hold and even into it a little bit more, they got a hold of some grant money and decided to take all of this idea, this ethos of what SparkLab is and what they do in their space, and actually provide kits for students in their area. So we've got a couple of different ways that we've been doing that.
All right. Marcy asked, have you considered a SparkLab for adults?
So yes, we have actually. We've considered that. We've considered, say, some like evening sessions. I think the fun title we threw around was Spark After Dark, and just like what that might look like. The space itself being open to the public, we have adults that will come in and actually engage in some of the activities. Sometimes it may look very kid-like, but it's really cool to see when adults and teenagers and college students come in and actually engage. And I know Abigail can talk a little bit more about that and just what that looks like. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about that.
So we do welcome any visitors that come in and want to explore the space. Often the older visitors, whether it's high school students, college students, or adults, require a little bit more encouragement. They come in, they look around, and they say, this is for kids, right? Not necessarily. Anybody can come in and invent. Anybody can have a good time if you just let go and try it. The solution you may come up with is something that we may not have seen before. You've got to just see what's there and start building it. Some of the challenges are a little bit more complicated than others and maybe more interesting to adults. But some of them right now on the floor, we have an activity that's called Design a Voting Poster. It has magnets from actual campaigns and chalk, and then 2 magnetic chalkboards that are sitting there, and you can design your voting poster however you want. And we've seen quite a bit of engagement there. Lots of parents come in with their children, and the child will sit down and design a voting poster, and the adult will sit there with them and work on one themselves. And then at the end, they take their photos, they compare their posters, and they talk about why they used the phrase they did or why they chose the magnets that they did. And that's really what the space is all about, is inventing something and talking about it. So we don't have SparkLab for adults specifically, but you are always welcome.
And we also, another thing that comes to mind too is we do have an exhibit space next to SparkLab that is called Places of Invention, which actually goes through invention, places that it's happened, and the time frames that it's happened in. It's geared towards just the general museum visitor, And that exhibition will soon be replaced by an exhibition called Change Your Game, which will include basically a bunch of ideas of invention through sport, and the idea of what invention looks like in sport, and kind of exploring your own inventive identity. Our target audience for that is like upper teens, but it also will be a little more geared towards adults than the Spark Lab space. Again, though, like Abigail said, anybody can invent. Everyone is inventive, and we welcome all adult inventors.
Tim, I'll take the next question. Melinda asked, do you allow school groups or just the general public? We allow both. We do not take any reservations. So if you are bringing your school group here, that's fine. You are certainly welcome, but Spark Lab is open on a first come, first served basis. So if you really want your students to come in and experience Spark Lab, I suggest you make that an early stop on your field trip. We may have to split your group, your class, we'll take groups of like 5 or 6, but we may have to split a class of 25 or 30 into smaller groups to accommodate the space and the activities. We want to make sure that everyone has a great time. So we do not take reservations, but any school group that is in the museum is allowed to come in. The general public is allowed to come in. We are currently open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eventually, our hours will increase, and we will be open Wednesday to Sunday, 11 to 4. Another question asked was, how do you evaluate your activities? Do you go back and make changes based on feedback?
Oh, I'll definitely take that one. So being that I get to create all the activities for our space, one of the things that we do is we actually do evaluate it. We have our staff and our volunteers give us anecdotal information on the activities and how they're doing in the space. There are a couple key things that we look for, and I'll get to that in a little bit here. But in the beginning of Spark Lab 2, we also had our facilitators with evaluation forms, and they would go out and basically observe family groups and do these forms and talk and look for things like inventive language, inventive traits, different things that people were doing, overcoming, the idea of overcoming something that's been challenging or hard. But when it comes to the making adjustments on our activities, that's actually my favorite part of the job, being that I get to design and build a lot of them. One of the things that is so much fun is watching kids interact with those activities and finding things that either are not durable enough or are too hard for kids to figure out, or things that actually that hinder that invention process, and finding ways to tweak those things just a little bit so that our visitors have the best experience, and that the focus of the activity is more about the process and engaging in that process, and the inventor visitor coming up with the invention that they had hoped to come up with. Some of these tweaks have looked like, or some of these changes have looked like things like just changing the color of something, changing the shape of something, making something lighter or heavier, just so that it is a little bit easier or harder to move. So there are a number of different little things that we've done to make those tweaks. And as a process, as we make those tweaks, one of the things that we're doing is we're kind of doing a bit of R&D to find out, what works best and what works best with the broadest audience, because most of the activities that we're creating in our Spark Lab here in DC, we're also developing them to make them available for Spark Lab uses on our network sites. So those network sites I talked about in the very beginning, we're trying to get those activities out to those sites. So we do quite a bit of changes and evaluation.
Someone asked, how can someone reach out to the Spark Lab for an international outreach project?
That is a good question. If you shoot an email to me, I will get that on to the right person. Usually the international projects are something that are our director, our deputy director of our center will handle, but I can make sure that information gets on to them.
Someone asked, have you seen differences in the ages or demographics of those that were visiting the Spark Lab pre-pandemic versus those that are engaging with you digitally since the pandemic?
So that's a little bit of a challenge. When it comes to the digital platforms, because they're meant to be basically anonymous, it's meant to be anonymous for the most part, and meant to be set up to protect kids' identity, so there's no personally identifiable information. We don't really know what ages we're getting on that end of the programs. So that's one of the biggest challenges. It's one of the things that we like the digital platform because it's 24 hours a day. It's anywhere that anybody wants to use it. It's a good resource for people, but the feedback and the ability to evaluate it is something that we don't have right now. So that's been a bit of a challenge. So we don't really know if there are any changes in that. But Abigail, if you'd like to, I'll let you speak a little bit about how we've seen differences in the people visiting in the physical space pre-pandemic and now.
Some of the differences we've seen, we have a little bit lower volume of visitors, and I've seen people who are less interested in collaborating with somebody who is outside of their group. We encourage collaboration across groups, whether it's a field trip group or a couple families that are in. We encourage collaboration, but we have seen people who are less inclined to collaborate right now. But we've still seen lots of middle school field trips. We recently started seeing some summer camp field trips coming in. Lots of family. We've had a fair number of international visitors recently. So I don't know that it's really changed that much, but I would say just maybe less volume.
Yeah. And I've noticed a few more like tightly knit family groups. We have been seeing a lot more of that, a lot more adult involvement too. I've noticed that a lot fewer, there are quite a number of fewer adults on their phones or on their devices while their kids are engaging in an activity. They generally are now more engaged in that process, which is a great thing to see. We really like seeing that. This, of course, is all anecdotal. We don't have any hard data on it, but these are just some of the things that we have been noticing day to day.
Melinda asked, have you considered a Spark Lab mobile unit?
That is something that's been talked about in multiple meetings, and that's a good question. We've talked about that in a number of meetings. We've talked about that with our advisory committee for our center. We've talked about that amongst ourselves as a Spark Lab team. Some of the things that we look at with it, though, right now, it's not something that we're capable of doing. One is just the idea of the staffing. As you may know, the staffing of a mobile unit it's pretty staff intensive, material intensive as well, and rather time intensive for moving those activities around or moving any of that material around, keeping track of it, packing and unpacking, all that kind of stuff. The last museum I worked in had an outreach program that was basically a pay to have them come out and do outreach, and the logistics of that program were pretty intense.
Daniel asked a two-part question. Did students share with you what they invented using your platforms during the pandemic? And which of your platforms got more use during the pandemic?
So we didn't have anybody sharing what they did. We encourage it in the documents that we have there, because the last step of the invention process is to share it or to sell it, basically. So basically letting people know about your invention, but we're not seeing that happen that much. I really wish that it would happen more often, but we are getting more traffic, I believe, through the lesson plans. And then it's interesting to see the trends of when school is in session and out of session. We see a pretty big drop right now. Actually, we were getting around 1,000 to 2,000 hits per month on the lesson plans and Instructables combined, and now it's in the mid hundreds. So it's changed a little bit in our total volume, but it's mostly just because of the cycles of the school season.
Which of the platforms got the most use during the pandemic?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot about that. So I would say that the Tinkercad lesson plans got more use than the Instructables, which actually are very similar to the lesson plans, but I think the Tinkercad lesson plans did, and I'm guessing that's just because it's a built-out lesson ready to go. You can do the same thing from Instructables. A lot of the content's the same, but it doesn't have as much of the robust back-end stuff for the teacher on that side.
Are there any other questions?
So it looks like we might be out of questions. That's all right. So again, if anybody has any questions going forward, feel free to email us. We'll be able to get those. We'll either be able to answer those or get those onto the right person to take those questions. And we appreciate you taking your time to listen to us and take part in this session. It was super challenging, as I'm sure it was for many of you in your classrooms, to go from a physical space to some sort of digital interactive. And just so you know, we are also thinking of our next steps in the digital world. And we right now are working on something in the Roblox platform. We know that that's a platform that's not quite integrated into schools because of what it is, and we understand that. We've had some talks with Roblox and have kind of talked about what that looks like. From our understanding, Roblox is actually in the process of trying to develop an education-based platform that has only education content on it that teachers can use. So there are some, we're actually looking forward to that type of space and that type of platform, because we know that in something like that, we can really, truly mimic the SparkLab space and kind of gamify it, make it fun, but also still make it that experience that SparkLab is. All right. So again, thank you for taking part in this session. It looks like we have about 2 or 3 minutes left, but I don't know if we need to belabor it too much. I'm not sure what it looks like on the back end, but I'm going to say thank you. All right. Okay. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll hear from some of you soon.